$2 million. That's the number sitting underneath a partnership announcement that dropped less than 3 weeks before the US Open main draw begins. And the reason it matters isn't just the size of it, it's who got there first. Not a racket brand. Marriott Bonvoy, one of the largest hospitality brands on the planet, looked at a 21-year-old from Quezon City with exactly one WTA title to her name. A career-high ranking of world number 20 reached just weeks ago and no Grand Slam quarterfinal on her resume yet, and decided she was worth a reported $2 million a year to put her face on their global tennis campaign. That decision tells you something about where this story actually is right now. Here's the payoff before anything else, because this announcement only makes complete sense once you understand the sequence it arrived in. This isn't a sponsorship that came after a Grand Slam title. This came after one WTA 500 title. Won 6 weeks ago in Washington against world number 3 Jessica Pegula, closed out with a final set bagel that left the tennis world scrambling to recalibrate what it thought it knew about the ceiling on this specific career. Between that title and this announcement, she played 2 more tournaments, climbed to a career-high ranking, sold out courts in 2 countries, and somehow managed to become the most commercially attractive name in women's tennis before she's ever reached a Grand Slam quarterfinal. That's the sequence. That's why a hotel brand writing a 7-figure check makes sense when you actually know what it's responding to. To understand why Marriott Bonvoy specifically getting there first is the detail worth sitting with longest, you have to think about how traditional tennis sponsorships actually work. The standard model has been essentially unchanged for decades. A player breaks through at a major, wins something significant on a big stage, and then watches the sponsorship market respond with a lag. Offers coming in over the following months as brands try to attach themselves to a proven, established commercial quantity. Then, if a player reaches a certain level of cultural penetration, the non-endemic brands start circling: car companies, watch companies, luxury goods. But hospitality brands don't typically move first. They don't usually sprint to the front of the line before the apparel deals are even locked in. The fact that Marriott Bonvoy did exactly that, attaching themselves to Eala before the more obvious categories even made their move publicly, tells you something specific about how they're reading the demand signal she's been generating all summer. And that demand signal, for anyone who's been paying attention to the last 6 weeks, has been anything but subtle. It started in Washington, where tournament owner Mark Ein told media that roughly 80% of the incoming ticket questions at his box office during that event were some version of the same sentence. When is Alex Eala playing? Not a question about the draw, not a question about the schedule, not a question about any of the other players at the tournament. One player's schedule dominates 4/5 of an entire event's ticket inquiries. Then it traveled to Toronto, where her opening match sold out in 30 minutes after organizers had already been forced to relocate her from a 2,800-seat court to a 12,500-seat stadium because demand had already blown past the original venue's capacity before the match even started. Then it showed up in Cincinnati, where over 3,000 tickets moved in a single burst for one session. Then the US Open announced her on the Arthur Ashe Stadium evening slate for Fan Week before the main draw even existed, and courtside seats were listing between $500 and nearly $700 on the secondary market for an exhibition that hasn't even been played yet. That is the demand map Marriott Bonvoy was looking at when they made this decision. Not a ranking sheet, not a Grand Slam trophy case. A demand map that showed a player whose ticket market had outgrown every court size thrown at it, whose name was dominating box office conversations at 4 separate tournaments across 2 countries, and whose cultural footprint in the Philippines, a nation of 115 million people, a market that global hospitality brands care enormously about, had already crossed from sports story into something closer to a national moment. When Marriott Bonvoy talks about their Tennis the World campaign, the phrase isn't incidental. The entire strategic logic of the partnership is that Eala represents a geographic and demographic audience that tennis's traditional commercial base has never meaningfully reached before, and Marriott Bonvoy wants to be the brand standing at that door when it opens, rather than scrambling to get there after someone else already has. Think about the geography of this for a second, because it's central to why this partnership makes more sense for a hospitality brand than for almost any other category of sponsor. 2 million Filipinos live in California alone. The Filipino diaspora spans the United States, Canada, the Middle East, Australia, and across Southeast Asia in numbers that represent one of the largest transnational communities on the planet. These are not people who are casually watching tennis from a distance. They are people who have been buying plane tickets to tournaments, organizing community bulk purchase groups for match sessions, filling arenas and refusing to leave, making tournament executives go on television to describe what they're witnessing as something they've never seen before in their own buildings. These are exactly the kind of people who travel, who stay in hotels, who book through loyalty programs, who, when a brand they associate with something they love offers them exclusive perks and early access tied to that connection, respond in exactly the way hospitality brands need their loyalty customers to respond. Marriott Bonvoy isn't just buying a tennis ambassador, they're buying a key to a community that travels in numbers and has been demonstrably, commercially active everywhere this player has shown up this summer. The specific structure of the partnership confirms this reading. The deal launches with Eala as the face of Tennis the World, a campaign that ties Marriott Bonvoy membership directly to tennis-related perks, including early access to Australian Open 2027 tickets for Bonvoy members. That detail is worth pausing on because it isn't incidental. The Australian Open is played in Melbourne in January, and it draws the largest Filipino tennis contingent outside of the Philippines itself because of the geographic proximity and because of Eala's personal connection to that tournament as a former Australian Open junior champion. Choosing the Australian Open as the specific premium perk to anchor the campaign's launch isn't a random scheduling decision. It's Marriott Bonvoy looking at exactly where this fan base travels, exactly when they travel there, and building their membership value proposition around the moment most likely to convert a Filipino tennis fan into a Marriott Bonvoy loyalty customer. That's not a coincidence. That's a targeting decision made by a global brand that has done its homework on exactly who Alex Eala's people are and what they actually do with their time and money. And the timing of this announcement, landing less than 3 weeks before the US Open main draw begins, isn't accidental either. This is deliberate placement inside the single highest attention window of Eala's career so far, a stretch of weeks where every major tennis media outlet, every Filipino sports outlet, and every casual sports fan who's heard her name this summer is going to be paying closer attention to her than at any previous point. Announcing a global brand partnership in this window doesn't just introduce the deal to tennis fans. It introduces it to the broadest possible audience at the exact moment when that audience is most engaged, most likely to share the news, and most likely to associate the brand with whatever happens to Eala at the US Open itself. If she makes a deep run at Flushing Meadows, which the Arthur Ashe sellout, the ranking, and the form all suggest is a genuine possibility rather than wishful thinking, every broadcast graphic that mentions Marriott Bonvoy next to her name is worth significantly more than any standalone ad by the brand could have purchased. The deal becomes the backdrop of a Grand Slam story rather than just a press release, and the US Open becomes Marriott Bonvoy's most valuable marketing event of the year, at no additional cost. That's the commercial logic underneath the announcement, but there's a personal dimension to this that deserves equal attention, because it's easy to reduce a sponsorship story to a transaction and miss what it actually represents for the player at the center of it. Alex Eala is 21 years old. She turned professional after winning the 2022 US Open Girls title and spent the next 2 years grinding through the lower tiers of the tour, qualifying for tournaments instead of being seeded into them, losing in qualifying rounds of Grand Slams, building a career the slow, unglamorous way that most professional tennis players have to build it. The specific loss that this summer has been quietly building toward erasing. The 2024 US Open qualifying exit against Roos that kept her out of the main draw entirely happened less than 2 years ago. She went from being the player who couldn't qualify for the US Open to being the player Marriott Bonvoy is paying $2 million a year to represent their global tennis campaign in the window right before the US Open begins. That arc, compressed into roughly 24 months, is not a normal sports trajectory. It's the kind of thing that usually takes 5 or 6 years of sustained top 20 results to produce commercially, and she's done it in less than 2. There's also something worth noting about what this specific partnership signals to the rest of the sponsorship market, because brand deals don't exist in isolation. They send signals to every other brand watching from the sidelines about what kind of asset is being priced and what category of return is available. When a global hospitality brand moves first, at a reported 7-figure annual number, on a player who has won WTA title and hasn't yet reached a Grand Slam quarterfinal, they're not just making a bet on one player. They're sending a signal to every other brand in the category that this window is closing, that the obvious commercial logic of attaching to this specific name has already been identified by a competitor, and that waiting for more traditional credentials to accumulate before moving is a strategy that will cost them the first-mover advantage that Marriott Bonvoy just captured. The racket companies and apparel brands that haven't moved publicly yet are now operating in a market where they know a major non-endemic brand has already made its move. That changes how every subsequent negotiation around Eala's commercial portfolio gets conducted, because the baseline has been publicly set at a level that demands the traditional sponsors either meet it or explain why they're valuing the same asset at a lower number. And underneath all of that commercial analysis sits a fact that's easy to understate if you're not paying close attention to the timeline, because the timeline is really where the most important part of this story actually lives. Not in the dollar figure, not in the campaign name, not in the specific perks attached to the Bonvoy membership. In the timeline. This entire story, the Washington title, the Toronto sellouts, the Cincinnati numbers, the Arthur Ashe booking, and now this Marriott Bonvoy deal landing, days before the US Open main draw begins, has unfolded inside approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks from a WTA 500 final against a top-3 opponent to a reported $2 million annual global partnership with one of the largest hospitality brands on the planet. Pause on that for a second, because it's easy to read past it without actually processing what it means in practice. 6 weeks is not a commercial timeline. 6 weeks is not how brand deals of this size get built, approved, negotiated, and announced. The internal process alone at a company the size of Marriott International, the legal review, the brand alignment sessions, the ambassador vetting, the campaign strategy, the contract terms, typically runs longer than the entire stretch of time between Eala winning in Washington and this announcement dropping. Which means Marriott Bonvoy wasn't watching the Washington final and then deciding to start exploring a partnership. They were already watching, already tracking, already building toward this before that trophy was even in her hands. The Washington title didn't create this deal. It was the trigger that turned a deal already in motion into one that couldn't wait any longer. That's not a minor distinction. That's the detail that tells you exactly how seriously the commercial world had already been studying this specific player before the general sports conversation caught up to what was happening. Because the general sports conversation, outside of Filipino tennis media and a handful of sharp tennis observers, was still treating Eala as a promising young talent with an interesting story rather than an imminent commercial force when Washington happened. The brands that were paying close attention didn't have that problem. They had already done the math on 115 million Filipinos, on a diaspora that travels and spends and organizes community viewing events and bulk buys tournament tickets and does all the things that matter to a global hospitality brand's loyalty program strategy. They had already mapped the demand curve that was showing up in box office numbers before the broader media narrative had a name for it. And they moved the moment the publicly visible signal, the title, the ranking jump, the press coverage, gave them the justification to move at the speed they had already been internally prepared to move at. That's not how tennis sponsorships typically work, and it's worth being specific about why, because the contrast matters. The traditional model for a non-endemic brand entering tennis at this level of investment runs something like this. A player has a breakthrough season, closes the year ranked somewhere in the top 15 or 20, produces results at 2 or 3 major tournaments significant enough to generate mainstream sports coverage outside of tennis-specific outlets, and then spends the following off-season fielding offers from brands that have spent the preceding months running audience analysis and competitor assessment before bringing a number to the table. The whole cycle from breakthrough to signed deal typically takes a full calendar year at minimum, and often longer. Brands and categories like hospitality don't usually jump the queue in front of racket companies and apparel brands, because those categories have faster, more obvious return on investment. A racket in her hand at Wimbledon is a direct product endorsement, and the math on that is simple. A hotel loyalty program appearing in her social content and tournament appearances is a longer, softer brand-building play that requires more conviction about the long-term trajectory to justify the investment before the resume fully supports it. Marriott Bonvoy skipped all of that. They didn't wait for the off-season. They didn't wait for a Grand Slam quarterfinal. They didn't wait for a second title or a top 10 ranking or any of the traditional checkboxes that usually precede a deal of this reported size. They moved in August, in the middle of a tournament stretch, weeks before the biggest Grand Slam of the hardcourt season, on a player whose peak ranking at the time of the announcement sat at world number 20. That is a level of commercial conviction that doesn't come from a 6-week analysis. It comes from months of watching a phenomenon build in real time and making a deliberate decision to be early rather than right on time, because being right on time in this specific situation was already going to mean being late. And being late in this specific market carries a cost that compounds the same way Eala's own momentum has been compounding all summer. Every week that passes without a signed deal is another week where a competitor brand gets to watch the same numbers, read the same box office reports, and draw the same conclusions. Except now with one more data point than the week before, one more confirmation that the trajectory is real, one more reason to accelerate their own internal timeline. Marriott Bonvoy understood this, which is why they didn't let the traditional process play out at its traditional pace. They understood that the first mover advantage in this specific situation wasn't just a nice commercial benefit, it was the entire strategic value of the deal. Getting there before the racket companies, before the apparel brands, before every other non-endemic sponsor that was almost certainly running the same internal analysis, meant owning the association in a way that no amount of money spent later can fully replicate. You can outspend a competitor's ambassador deal. You cannot outspend the fact that they were already there first. Something about the speed of this whole arc, the compression of it, the way one result in Washington seems to have triggered a cascade of commercial, competitive, and cultural developments that would normally be spread across multiple seasons, suggests this isn't just a good year for a good player finding her form at the right time. It looks more like a tipping point. A moment where a specific talent, a specific fan base, and a specific calendar window aligned in a way that doesn't happen on schedule, doesn't happen because anyone planned it, and doesn't happen more than once or twice in a generation inside any individual sport. Tipping points don't announce themselves in advance. That's what makes them tipping points rather than predictable milestones you can schedule around and prepare for at a comfortable pace. They reveal themselves in retrospect, through the evidence they leave behind, the sellouts that happened before anyone expected them, the deals that closed faster than the industry said they could, the numbers that kept compounding instead of plateauing the way normal momentum eventually does. And the evidence here has been accumulating in one direction without a single interruption since Washington. Every tournament added a bigger number than the one before it. Every city produced the same box office behavior that the last city had already confirmed. Every week brought another data point that should have been the ceiling and turned out instead to be the floor for whatever came next. The Marriott Bonvoy announcement is the clearest single commercial confirmation of what that direction actually is. Not because a sponsorship deal proves anything about tennis results, but because a global brand committing at this level and at this speed is the market's most credible, most expensive, most public statement that the phenomenon is real, durable, and worth betting on before the traditional credentials fully catch up to what the numbers are already saying. Brands at this scale don't make seven-figure commitments on sentiment. They make them on data, on audience analysis, on competitive intelligence, on a reading of the market that has been stress-tested internally before a single dollar gets committed publicly. When that process produces a deal this fast, on a player this early in her conventional resume, it means the data they were looking at was not close. It means the answer came back unambiguous enough that the normal pace of deliberation felt like unnecessary risk rather than responsible diligence. That is what a tipping point looks like from the inside of a boardroom, and that is exactly what this announcement is confirming from the outside. Which brings everything back to the 2 weeks sitting directly in front of her, because all of this context only matters in proportion to what happens next. The Marriott Bonvoy deal doesn't launch her into the US Open as just another seeded player riding a hot summer into a Grand Slam. It launches her as the face of a global brand's entire tennis strategy, as the commercial centerpiece of a campaign built around exactly the demographic that has been filling stadiums, selling out courts, and generating the kind of box office behavior that tournament executives have been describing on television as things they've never seen before in their own buildings. The deal makes the US Open personal for Marriott Bonvoy in a way it wasn't before this week, which means every broadcast graphic, every match highlight, Every press conference clip that carries her name over the next 2 weeks is now simultaneously a Marriott Bonvoy brand moment, whether anyone explicitly frames it that way or not. That's the nature of ambassador deals at this level. The brand doesn't just exist in the campaign materials, it exists in the attention surrounding the person, and the attention surrounding this person over the next 2 weeks is going to be larger than at any previous point in her career. The question the next 2 weeks will actually answer isn't about the sponsorship itself, or the ticket demand, or the ranking number, or the Arthur Ashe exhibition sellout. Those stories are already written, the numbers are already in, the commercial bet has already been placed. The question is whether the tennis itself catches up to everything that has been built around it, whether a 21-year-old from Quezon City, carrying the weight of a nation's attention and a global brand's investment, and 2 years of unfinished business with a tournament that once turned her away at the qualifying stage, can walk into Arthur Ashe Stadium and turn all of it into something that makes everything that came before it look like prologue rather than the main event. Because right now, as impressive as the last 6 weeks have been, there is a real argument that the story is still in its setup phase. The ticket sellouts are the setup. The ranking climb is the setup. The Washington title is the setup. The Marriott Bonvoy deal is the setup. What happens at the US Open is either the payoff that justifies all of it or the plot twist that reframes what all of it was actually building toward. That's the chapter Marriott Bonvoy just signed on to be part of, and they signed on knowing full well that the payoff isn't guaranteed. That a 21-year-old playing her second US Open main draw could run into a tough first-round opponent on a bad day and exit before anyone expected. They signed on anyway because the bet they're actually making isn't on one specific tournament result. It's on a trajectory that has shown no signs of slowing down, on a fan base that has shown no signs of conditional loyalty, and on a commercial window that was visibly closing the longer they waited. And if the last 6 weeks are any indication of how fast this story moves when it decides to move, 2 weeks from now, the conversation isn't going to be about a hotel loyalty program's ambassador announcement or a reported annual figure or a campaign called Tennis the World. It's going to be about whatever happened on the courts at Flushing Meadows and whether the brand sitting next to her name on the broadcast graphic made the smartest bet in tennis this decade or simply the fastest one. Drop your prediction for how deep she actually goes at the US Open, not the optimistic version, the honest one, based on the draw, the form, and the physical toll of the summer she's already had. And stick around, because we are covering every single round, every match result, every number that comes out of that tournament in real time, starting from the moment the draw drops and running all the way to whatever the final Saturday of the US Open looks like with or without her name still in it.